Hello and welcome to a new episode of Talking Law from Women in the Law UK. I'm Sally Penni, MBE, the barrister at Doughty Street Chambers in Manchester, the Joint Vice Chair of the Association of Women Barristers and the founder of Women in the Law UK. Today I'm talking law in an interview with human rights barrister Adam Wagner. Adam practices at Doughty Street Chambers, is a visiting professor at Goldsmiths University of London and the founder of award-winning charity EachOther, which aims to increase public support for human rights. We started our conversation by discussing Adam's rather indirect route into the law.
Well, I never wanted to be a lawyer when I was growing up. And in fact, I didn't want to be a lawyer or even think about being a lawyer when I was at university. I left university where I studied politics, philosophy and English, sort of very broad liberal arts kind of degree, which, reflects the fact that I've got lots of interests.
Yes.
And I worked for a Jewish youth movement, which I headed up in Manchester, where I grew up, for a year after I finished. It's a socialist youth movement which I was involved in since I was a child, and that was a sort of big part of my my growing up and my sort of developing my values. There's a lot of focus on social activism and communal living, that sort of thing. And after that, I went to study in the States. While I was studying in the States, still not law, I studied political science. I did a master's. And while I was there, I was kind of it was in the post 9/11 world. I was there a couple of years after 9/11, or sort of 4 or 5 years after. And I was very taken. I'd become sort of activated, I guess, by that whole by that chain of events. In fact, I changed my degree from English to politics and philosophy straight after 9/11 happened, because I just lost interest almost overnight in what I was studying. And I really just was desperate to figure out what these big events meant, what these strange sort of emotional and political world happenings, how to interpret them, how to predict what was going to happen in the future. I felt personally pretty unsafe.
Yes.
And I think that was the sort of journey that led me to law. And when I was in the States, I came into contact with activist lawyers of the kind that I had never come across before. I mean, I didn't know any barristers when I was growing up. My dad's a solicitor in Manchester, and but it's in a very different area of law, and I just hadn't come into contact with law in that context, in the sort of activist, political type law.
Yes.
And once I saw that, I thought, well, that's quite a good compromise, I guess, between my different interests, and also I wanted to join a profession where I could have a hope of a reasonable income, and live in London, where I wouldn't be able to live with my family because they were in Manchester. So it all kind of came together, and I discovered that there was this new Human Rights Act in the UK, which I had sort of vaguely heard about, and I looked into it and I thought, well, that seems to be where I want to practice and develop that as an area, and that was the start of my journey.
Yes. Well, Adam, you do an awful lot. I'm going to come to your memorable cases if you like, but you, beyond practicing law, really have been involved and spent a lot of your working career to increase public knowledge and understanding of human rights. One of the things you've done is to set up a charity called EachOther. And you've got a human rights podcast. I'm going to plug all those things towards the end. But I really wanted to ask you about, you strike me as quite a doer. You put your mind to something and you do it. And so I wonder if you can just tell us why you do more than just practice law, and why human rights law, which has led you to charity and some of your other work too.
I guess a few different things. It's always just come very naturally to me to do this public role. I think partly because I came through this background. I mentioned this, the youth movement I was involved in, but a huge part of that was sort of education, informal education. And, running camps for children, that sort of thing. That was my passion growing up, and really where I spent most of my spare time. And I think I brought a lot of that sort of informal education and movement building expertise into law, but it wasn't obvious to me where that would fit. When I joined the bar, it seemed very fusty and old-fashioned, which it is. And I was in quite a sort of, a very nice but quite old-fashioned kind of chambers right in the middle of Temple. But at the same time, there was this new idea of social media, which was just sort of developing. Barristers were starting to have blogs, and Twitter was just opening up. And I've always been quite techie as well. I used to design websites and that sort of thing. So all those things came together, and I just thought, well, I'll have a go at this. And frankly, as well, because I was in a chambers where I wouldn't have that much opportunity to do human rights work, particularly on the claimant side, I knew that I needed to have some sort of outlet for that interest, whilst doing the usual sort of common law, early career stuff, going around the county courts, doing road traffic accidents, fishing license prosecutions, whatever I could do. And at the same time, trying to build a sort of public law practice. So I started writing a blog, the UK Human Rights blog, which became really popular really quickly, because I think it filled a gap in the market. There wasn't really accessible expert level journalism about human rights law, but at the same time there were starting to be cases of real sort of public importance and interest that, because of the development of the Human Rights Act and lawyers using it more effectively and judges becoming experts themselves in applying it. Just around that time, I guess, like 2000, late, the end of the first decade of this century, there was just that bit more interest. And it kind of, I hit the ground running in that respect, and it became very popular, and I went from there. But I am definitely a doer. I mean, my long-suffering family will tell you that when I've got a new project, it becomes, I guess for similar to you, it becomes all-consuming, and I'll, bash away at it. And if it doesn't work, I'll bash away at something different but similar that will maybe correct the errors of the last thing. And I've just built things like that.
It's really, really interesting. You touched on it there about the cases that you've been doing, because actually many people know you from your COVID work. I mean, you've assisted us all to understand the regulations. But more interestingly, I suppose, to this extent, you've been involved in some really quite high-profile inquiries and cases. You acted in 2 alleged war crimes during the Iraq War, mid-staff's inquiry into the systematic failings of the NHS, then in the independent child sexual abuse inquiry for Harvey Proctor, falsely accused. I mean, I can carry on going, and the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry. So, really quite interesting cases and high profile. But I wonder, what's the most memorable case for you?
I've got a few, I guess. I would reflect what you said, that the first ever time that I appeared in a court as a tribunal was when I was a student doing the free representation unit in social security tribunals, and I have a very strong memory of that first time that my argument succeeded. It was something I think it was to do with vibration white finger. I think it was. It was about somebody who had a problem with his finger from working with machine tools, and he had been turned down for his whatever disability living allowance. And I remember that practical experience was unbelievably exciting and invigorating, because just being able, the difference I could make, just doing a bit of research, figuring out the right argument, and then putting it to a tribunal was just, amazing. I remember talking about that in my pupillage interviews. I think that the case that probably changed my career was the Jogi case, which was the case about joint enterprise, where they went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court reversed 30 years of law on joint enterprise. And I think the reason it was important for me was because I was junior to Felicity Gary. I probably shouldn't have been,
Yes.
because I'm not a criminal junior, and I think it's a bit. I think it annoys criminal practitioners. It's probably the only criminal case I've ever done was that case. It's probably one of the most important in the history of criminal law. But I was Felicity brought me in to do the Article 7 of the Human Rights Act arguments about principle of legality, and I actually made the arguments in the Supreme Court, as in I did the oral advocacy on that part, which was just extraordinary. And I think that case probably allowed me to move chambers, which is something that I'd been, thinking about for quite a long time, and I was just waiting for the right opportunity. And I think because I got some sort of visibility from that work to members of my now chambers, Doughty Street, it probably gave me a stepping stone. But it was also, just amazing to be involved. And I'll always be thankful to Felicity, who's a force of nature herself. I think she's been on your podcast.
She has been, and we had to control her because she said herself, yes, she said, I don't know, I say me, I had to control her because there was so much to talk about. She really is a force of nature.
She is. And it was an amazing experience to watch her develop that case, in a way, because I've been doing a lot of defendant work on the public law and human rights side, and it's very different. You respond to the arguments. You don't really develop a case. It's not strategic in that way. I mean, it's sort of tactical, but it's not the same as building a team, building the arguments, knowing who's going to do what, how to approach the judges, all that kind of thing. And I think, and also dealing with the small p politics of all the campaigning organisations and the other potential cases and that sort of thing, which is all in those big cases. And now I've been, lucky to be involved in quite a few of those big cases. That it's a different dynamic. It's really the top of the kind of public interest type law tree. It's where it's the most, high stakes, high profile kind of stuff. And it was amazing to see her work. I think, she really is amongst, if not the best lawyer that I've ever worked with in terms of the public interest type law. And it was just amazing to be involved. It was a sort of spine tingling moment when we sat in the courtroom, when you could still sit in courtrooms, and hear the judgment being given, and there was a sort of gasp in the room. It was really extraordinary. So that case does stand out for me.
Yes. Well, as a criminal practitioner, I don't begrudge you, but it is a very good judgment and a very good case on joint enterprise. I always encourage pupils and juniors to read, really. Adam, I do a lot to uphold a profession that we both love and a legal system that we're both very interested in. And as I said before, you have your own podcast, you're a trustee of the charity that you set up, actually. And you've been doing loads on COVID. I don't mean literally, but the COVID regulations. And so my question is, why do you do these things? I really admire what you've done and, your ability to explain the law. You talked a lot about, your early youth work. Did it start there?
Yeah, well, I've always enjoyed public speaking, but not in the kind of, I was never a debater. I was probably not the most suited to the bar in a way, because I wasn't involved in the debating societies, and that's what I never really saw the point. In a way, I thought, let other people argue for fun. I don't, I actually don't enjoy arguing that much with people. I don't enjoy conflict. So yeah, I'm not necessarily that well suited to the bar. But what I do, I love the area of law that I'm involved in. I find it utterly fascinating. And when I find something interesting, my instinct is to try and bring people into it and help people understand it. And it matters a lot to me that I, as a lawyer, and I don't think this needs to apply to all lawyers, but as a lawyer, I feel a responsibility to wider society to help people understand the law, to help people access the law. I don't begrudge anybody that doesn't do that, but I think that is certainly in the tradition of the English bar. I think it's the kind of lawyer. When I became a lawyer, I wanted to be a public lawyer, and I don't mean that in the narrow sense of being involved in administrative court cases. I mean being a lawyer in public. I didn't really, there was nobody I kind of modeled that on in the UK. Maybe I read Geoffrey Robertson's book, who's now my head of chambers, and I've worked with him quite a lot since I've been at Doughty Street. And I thought that, those are the kind of cases I want to be involved in. That's the kind of, this is the kind of thing I want to do. But beyond that, it just developed organically. Over the COVID regulations, in a way, I feel like I've achieved a lot through my explanations of the law and doing, helping people understand it. But in a way, I've been sort of preparing for that for a decade, as in I've been doing this same thing with human rights law in all different capacities for 10, 12 years, trying to help people understand it. And so when all of a sudden, there were very, very complicated laws coming into force every few days that impact on everybody's private and personal lives and working lives, it was very natural to me to start trying to decode those for people. But what the really nice thing about it, or nice is probably the wrong word, is that I feel like it's really segued nicely with the work I'm doing as well, because I've been working as a specialist advisor for the Joint Committee on Human Rights. So helping to input into an ongoing inquiry on the human rights implications of COVID, and also been involved in quite a lot of cases involving the COVID regulations, the right to protest, involving the right to education, that sort of thing, because I've sort of married together those two aspects of my working life, which I've always been trying to make work together, but it's not always been obvious how to do that.
I must say, whenever anybody asks me about COVID, and I do go back to regulations, I do direct them to your Twitter account and say this chap is really, really good. And, lay people, not lawyers necessarily. Adam, I'm a bit late to Twitter, and I agree with the point you were making about blogging and all of that. And I'm very late to it, even though I'm older than you, certainly in terms of call. And so I wanted to ask you really about confidence to use Twitter, and then ask you about aspiring lawyers and any advice that you might have for aspiring lawyers. So firstly, when did you kind of feel comfortable to use Twitter?
That's a great question. I started blogging when I was a pupil. And I really, I felt very, very, talk about imposter syndrome. I felt like, I felt it was ridiculous that I would be blogging about human rights law. And I really, I hadn't even studied human rights law at law school, because I don't think there was an option.
No.
I'd done public law. So I was learning as I went. And because, I think because of that, I developed some sort of rules for myself. And the rules were, imagine a judge reading this blog, a judge you're going to be in front of. And that doesn't mean everything has to be right. But I think the rule I set for myself was always linked to primary sources. This was the rule. Actually, these were the sort of rules of the human rights blog as well. It used to send contributors. Always go to primary sources. Never quote a quote of legislation. Always link to the legislation itself and read it and make sure what you're saying is accurate. Second, and equally to judgments. Never use somebody else's summary of a judgment. Always go to the judgment itself, and always explain what you're talking about in plain English. Don't use acronyms. Don't use legalese. And I think all of those rules are safeguards, especially if you're very junior, because ultimately, if you've done your research and you've written something as if a judge will read it, then you can't be blamed for getting something wrong. You can be, criticised, but you can't be blamed. It's not your fault. You've done your best. And if you're diligent enough, then and also if you admit that, that's another thing that I always try to do, is I always admit I've made a mistake, and I always have, and I always make it clear. I'm very quick to delete things or to correct things and to say I've made a mistake. And I think that's a real danger when you're very junior, is you think that that's a kind of sign of weakness, whereas I think I've always thought that's a sign of strength.
Yes, I agree.
If you're straightforward and people learn to trust you. And not because they think you're going to get everything right. Nobody gets everything right. But what they know is that you're a fair dealer. You are You are someone who does their research, you link to primary sources, you say when you've got something wrong, and you listen to people, to people telling you you've got something wrong. You understand that social media is a conversation. And I think that if you're a very junior, I mean, when I started on Twitter, there were practically no lawyers. There was, people like David Alan Green and Carl Gardner and these sort of, very esoteric group of people in different areas who just fancied doing blogging and were good at it.
Yes.
And I remember I tweeted at first from the UK Human Rights blog account, and I was at an event. I guess this is about 10 years ago almost. And David Alan Green said to me, look, because we used to do these events where we would talk about legal blogging because it was a sort of, new thing. And he said, why don't you just go in your own name? Don't be scared of going in your own name. And he'd also been under a pseudonym for a while. So I sort of did it. I took the plunge in about 2011 and I never looked back. But I mean, look, if you get involved in Twitter, especially in sort of political issues, where those issues which cross over from law to politics, you're bound to get into sticky situations. But I think, the rules I've got for Twitter are sort of slightly different. My rules are never be personally abusive. And never go for a person generally. I just, I say I don't really like conflict. I don't mind what I mean by that is I don't mind getting into arguments. I don't like it, but if I have to, I will, because if I think something's the right thing to do, then I will. But if you avoid attacking someone personally because of who they are rather than what they're saying, you can avoid 90% of the risks, I think, of social media. And also just, be polite. It may sound a bit old fashioned. I don't swear on social media. I never swear on social media. Again, it's that thing of what will the judges think?
Yes.
Tell you a funny story. After the Brexit case, after the prorogation case, I had a message from a Supreme Court justice via a member of Chambers saying, thank you very much for your tweets about the case. And that sort of just confirms me. I know that judges read Twitter. They certainly have the last few years, but you've just got to realise that you are in, that you're in an environment where people are listening. And the more high profile and the more followers you get, the more likely it is that you're going to be listened to by the people you are aiming what you're saying at or interested in. So I just always try to keep that in view. It doesn't always work. Sometimes you will say things in anger or in too quickly, or you'll get something wrong, but you just got to roll with it if you want to be involved in those kind of, there's a lot of benefits to it. You get to have amazing conversations with the most extraordinary sort of group of people. You can have a real influence, like I have, I think, over COVID. And, it's kind of worth it, but it's just about being careful and cautious, especially for junior lawyers.
That's such great advice. I have seen some unkind messages on there when I was doing my research, and you dealt with them so well. I often think, would my mum approve of any sort of swearing, or and I think,
well,
God.
Your mum's the other. Your mum and the judges, they're the same sort of thing, isn't it? It's or your children. Do you want your children to be reading this stuff when they're old enough? When my children are just getting old enough to read it, I don't want them seeing me being, modeling behavior which I wouldn't expect from them. Being a bully or being aggressive and hostile. It's not. I think it's much easier to be aggressive and hostile on social media, because I think that's a lot of your instinct, especially when someone's being aggressive and hostile to you, is to be like that. But just like in court, it never helps. It's never good to be hostile or aggressive. It can get you a very short-term sort of impact, but it's always going to come back and bite you in the end.
Adam, I wonder if I can ask you about what you think about diversity at the bar. And I just wonder what you think about the progress we're making, if at all.
I think that there's some sort of glacial progress. I think there are thankfully more different kinds of people at the bar than there were not that long ago. Just talking about men and women at the bar, I've been lucky to be in two chambers, one Crown Office Row and Doughty Street, where there are a lot of female, senior female members. And I've been led by a lot of female QCs. But I know that I think that the kind of public areas of law are better in that respect than commercial, it seems to me. Although I'm not a commercial lawyer, so I can't speak for that. I really thought what Lady Hale said when you interviewed her about the diversity of experiences is really important. It's I think obviously your sex, your gender, your skin color, your religion, these are all really important. But I think what we really need in the courts is diversity of experiences as well. And I'm a strong believer that your experiences impact on the way you see the world in quite a fundamental way. And when you're in court, I mean, I've been in court for acting for the broadest possible range of people in my career, from government ministers to homeless people to pretty much any kind of person. And I see the way judges handle cases, and it's so predicated on their life experiences. And I think it's such a kind of mistake to think, as I think some people do, that judges are just, you become a judge and you can have this objective, godlike view of life. It's just nonsense. The difference between someone who's grown up, on a landed estate, who's never had to think about money, who's drifted into the bar because that was their father's and grandfather's profession, versus somebody who has, grown up not knowing any lawyers, who has grown up, on a council estate, or whatever the difference in the background is. I just think that they're fundamental. And I think when judges are deciding these cases that involve, the kind of areas that I'm involved in, social interest type issues, they can get some understanding, and some judges are naturally more empathetic and able to do that. But I just think we could do with a lot more diversity of experience generally. But look, I'm a white man, so I've had all the possible advantages of getting into the bar, and I still found it, very hard. It took me a couple of years to find a pupillage, that sort of thing. But it's I know that I speak from a position of significant privilege in that
Yes.
in that respect.
Thank you for kind of saying it, because sometimes I'm a heterosexual woman with 3 children. That's actually a privilege by comparison to, our colleagues who are from the LGBTQI community, for example, or the trans community. So it is really important.
Can I just say one more thing about that as well?
Yes.
Just about, I've been very involved unexpectedly, as in I didn't really think this would be part of my career, but for the last 3 years, I guess, I was very involved in the issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And that was, something that growing up as a Jewish person, that was very sort of close to the bone for me. And it was something which if you grow up Jewish, you have a sort of strange sort of double life in a way, because you can, if you're a white male like I am, you can sort of walk around and nobody knows you're Jewish unless you tell them. And so you don't suffer discrimination in the same way. It's not the same kind of discrimination as I think black people suffer, who, you can't pretend you're not black. It's not something which, when you walk into a room, you can just choose whether you reveal it or not. But it's always been important to me to make clear publicly what my identity is and what my background is, because there aren't many Jewish people in the UK. There certainly aren't very many Jewish, barristers who are out and, talking about it. So, but that experience of being involved in that issue, which was very, as you'll know, very sort of politically and sociologically complicated and very, it was very intense and difficult for people who were involved. Fighting for my own community is something that I didn't expect I'd be doing in the law. And it's something that I, particularly through the Equality and Human Rights Commission investigation, which I was very involved in, and it kind of, I got involved in that. I triggered it on behalf of a client, and then, acted in it, and then it finished. I feel like that experience was quite eye-opening for me personally, and something which I want to bring to bear on the work I do, and the work I have done on for other communities.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I did watch that closely, and it did cause a lot of practitioners, or just, lay people, the public, to question what was going on. And Thank you. And because I think we can all be more than lawyers. We can be lawyers in so many ways. So thank you for sharing that. Can I ask you about COVID? I'm very concerned about the impact of COVID on people entering the profession. And I just wonder, if they were entering now, what advice would you give students, undergrads, pupils, really, as to how to carry on? I suppose a resilience point.
Yeah, I mean, it's made something which was already very difficult even more difficult. I think two things I've noticed is there are less pupilages. I know my old chambers has suspended its pupilages, although funnily enough, I've been a pupil supervisor for the first time this year, so we've still got our pupil program going. But that was difficult as well, because I couldn't be in chambers as much as I would have wanted to be. So we did 1 day a week in the end, plus courts. There's a lot of online stuff. But I think that the other thing I've noticed is that, I do a lot of people ask me for work experience, and I try and give it when I can. Yeah. But it's a lot more difficult because I'm not in court so much. An online work experience where you watch someone in an online court is not really the same. It's not being there. But also not being able to do things like the free representation unit and those sorts of, I know they're still operating, but they're not being those in-person hearings to be able to do, and not being able to network as well. I think just these are really, really big. It's a big deal for the bar, because the bar is partly about, applying for those pupilages. It's partly about networking and, being your own business. I think that's a really big part of what the bar is you've got to, it's not enough to just get into a good chambers and work as hard as you can. You've got to be out there and networking and to get on, really. I just think that's part of it. So the advice I'd give to incoming practitioners is it's going to be tough, unless you are a super genius, the super genius, which I never was. I spent a couple of years, I think I did 24 applications and succeeded in 1 in the end for pupillage. And it wasn't quite in the type of chambers I wanted to be in. It took me a long time to navigate towards the work that I wanted to do. There's a lot of grunt work and a lot of going around the country and doing things that I wasn't particularly passionate about, but I knew I needed to do a good job to get to the next thing and take the opportunities when they came. So I think the best advice that I can give is to, if you want to be a barrister and you've decided this is for you, then you always look to the medium and long term. So think, where do I want to be in 5 years' time? Where do I want to be in 10? And there isn't much point thinking of where you want to be in 1 or 2 years' time, because unless you are very lucky or very, very, very good, and that will be very few people, you'll end up not doing quite the thing you want to do. You might find the thing you want to do isn't the thing you want to do. So you've just got to think, where do I want to be in 5? Where do I want to be in 10? Take all the opportunities you can. Don't let knockbacks, give you too much of a headache, and try not to watch other people as well, because they always look better on paper, or on, I guess now it's on LinkedIn, or on their profile than they are, because nobody puts their failures on LinkedIn or on their chamber's profile, or no one that I've ever seen. But you will get lots of knockbacks. It's a tough old game.
Keep going,
but not at the expense of your sort of, life. I think, don't wait forever, because at some point there are lots of other interesting things apart from the bar. It's got its upsides and downsides. So I think don't give it a good try if that's what you want to do, but don't wait forever.
Yes, quite. Well, talking about waiting forever, I suppose spare time is what I'm thinking. I notice you've contributed to a couple of books, or assisted. Fake Law, which is the Secret Barrister's book. I'm sure I saw your name in there, having read it at our book club, and various other books. So I wanted to ask you, really, who or what is your favourite book, and do you have a favourite fictional lawyer?
Oh God, my favourite book. I love reading. I've always loved reading, and I read very, very widely. So I'm probably not. I'm not very. I could sort of do Lady Hale's Fudge, which was
Yes.
probably usually whatever book I'm reading just read is the book that I love. I what have I read recently which I love? I usually really love authors, and authors are my are where I go for, rather than particular books. Like, I read popular books, but I love Kazura Shigeru has always been one of my favorite writers since I studied Remains of the Day, I think at A level. I will read anything by Robert Harris, who I think is actually one of the best writers about law. He writes his Cicero trilogy is absolutely brilliant. The first two, especially about law. And I went to see him speak at, I think, a justice event and asked him why is he so good. And his book about the Dreyfus trial is really it is the best book that I've read about a sort of a trial that is more than a trial that becomes a sort of national event, which sometimes happens in every legal jurisdiction. On TV, I really don't like watching programs about lawyers. I find it really grating on the whole, and also stressful. I usually sit at night with my laptop on my knee, doing whatever I've got to do. And the last thing I want in the background is another blinking lawyer, getting something slightly wrong. But I don't know. I don't. So fictional lawyers, I'm not that into them, I'm afraid.
No, that's all right. That's all right. People often say Atticus Finch, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
But no, I know what you mean.
I liked Atticus Finch. When I read To Kill a Mockingbird when I was doing GCSE, I liked Atticus Finch, but I sort of found him a bit worthy. I don't know. He didn't. He seemed like a sort of moral. What's the right word? A sort of moral example rather than a character. I really understood. I really loved the story and I loved the principles of it. But as a character, I don't know. The lawyers who live out their values don't always have those values when you actually get to know them. Is my experience. I find lawyers are quite a complicated bunch. Barristers especially are quite a complicated bunch. And I think the personal quite often doesn't fit with the professional in some strange way. So I'm a bit more interested in the fictional representations of the sort of flawed personalities. I think doggedness is probably the key skill, the key sort of personality trait as a lawyer, rather than values that actually end up getting people succeeding in a way.
Yes. Well, Adam, I can see a guitar or something in the background. Is it a guitar?
Yeah, there is.
So I want to, and I know you've got 2 children. So I want to find out what you do for well-being, because you do so much. And I'm very concerned about well-being at the bar. I think we all work such long hours. So what do you do to relax? Is it the guitar?
Yeah, well, you'll notice the guitar is in my office, which is, and that's for a reason. It's because that's how I quite literally calm myself down usually when I need to sort of blank out for a bit. I love playing the guitar. I'm not that good, but that comes from my socialist youth movement, sitting around a campfire, youth. And so, no, I love playing the guitar. I cycle every day, or mostly every day, for about an hour. I need sort of regular exercise. It's a sort of, I find that very important for well-being. And when I don't get it, my well-being suffers. I try and spend as much time with my children as I can. Going back to diversity and sexism, I guess my wife's taken the brunt of homeschooling responsibilities during this crisis because of her work is just a bit more affected by COVID. And I realised that I'm very privileged, even just to be able to sit here in my office with the door closed while my children are being schooled by my wife downstairs. My wife's name is Julia. I realise that is a sort of big enabler for me and something that's very important to acknowledge.
Yes. And of course, all the women who have been carrying on working throughout, myself included, and trying to homeschool. I think we all need a badge, even if we haven't been working. So I think Julia needs like a massive sticker and some flowers going on there.
She definitely does. I mean, I do a bit of the homeschooling, but I think it's been a very difficult time, and women have taken the brunt in this period, undoubtedly.
Yes. Well, Adam, we're coming to the end. I'd like to ask you what's next. I believe that we need more leaders in silk or on the bench. And I wonder if you had plans, or in fact, if you were just going to write a book of your own. I'd
definitely like to write a book at some point. I've had a book in my head for about close to 10 years. But what's generally happens is every time I write a sort of book proposal and try and get it off the ground, I end up doing something different with it, like setting up a charity or a podcast or something, because I sort of realize the cost benefit sits better with doing something different to try and get to the same aim. But I'd love to write something about COVID law, and this extraordinary year of, hopefully not much longer, of COVID law making, which is just so strange and interesting and flips around many of the assumptions we have about the interaction between law and the general public, leaving aside criminal law, just this idea that every action we take can be illegal if it's if we've got the wrong intention or the wrong reason for doing it. And I would like to write something about that. It's just all about getting the time and the right model and the right vehicle for it.
Yes. Tell me about it. I'm totally with you. Well, Adam, finally, you're a professor of law at Goldsmiths University and you host the Human podcast. And so I wonder if you can tell us, how to listen to it, how that came about, and how people can support it. I'm a frequent listener and I've been donating to it. So how did the podcast come to be?
Thank you for listening and for donating. That's above and beyond. The Better Human podcast was just something that it was just something I thought that there wasn't one, just like there wasn't a human rights blog, just like there wasn't a charity which provides human rights news and information. I thought there wasn't a good human rights podcast. So I'm going to do one. And I set it up. It wasn't that difficult, but I was lucky to find Goldsmiths, because I was setting up this visiting professorship at Goldsmiths, and they very kindly sponsor it. So that enabled me to employ an editor and a researcher, and it's gone from there. And it's just kind of in things that I'm interested in, topics that I'm interested in, things that people suggest to me, people that I want to talk to. I guess a bit like this podcast. And I think that's the best kind of podcast, is where it's just something that somebody's interested in and hopes that other people will be interested in as well. And that usually comes through in the conversations.
Yes, absolutely. And it's at the Better Human Podcast.
Yeah, you just search Better Human Podcast on any of your podcast providers and you'll find it.
And any plans to return to Manchester? I think we on the Northern Circuit would love to see you returning home, as it were.
Yeah,
or are you settled in London?
I'm really settled in London. My parents and my sister are still in Manchester, and I've got many happy memories. And I do go up in non-COVID times. We go up there quite a lot, and I do actually come up to court. I've been up in the beautiful Manchester Civil Justice Centre quite a lot in recent years, doing various bits of administrative law. But no plans to move back, as lovely as it would be.
Yes, yeah. Well, the weather's improved, Adam. So
I'll take your word for that.
Well, Adam Wagner, thank you for talking law with me, Sally Penni. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sally. It's been a real pleasure for me too.
A huge thank you to Adam Wagner for coming to be interviewed on Talking Law with me. I'd love you to get in touch and let me know what you think of the podcast. And of course, do subscribe so you don't miss a thing. You can find and follow me on Twitter at SallyPenni1. Just search for Sally Penni, MBE. There's a new Law and Guidance webinar series which you can see on YouTube at the Women in the Law UK YouTube channel, or you can listen to it in podcast form. You can also search for the Talking Law books 1 and 2 and Volume 3, which is out soon and available on Amazon. Thanks to our production team, Sam Walker and Michael Blades at What Goes On Media. Bye for now, and see you soon.